daylight already. It had come too soon. He had had no time yet to decide what to do. He had gone to sleep. A most extraordinary thing. His distress was appeased by the simple thought that there was no need for him to do anything. After drinking his chocolate, which Spire received on a tray from some woman on the other side of the door, he informed him that he intended to devote the whole day to his correspondence. A table having been arranged to that end, close to an open window, he started writing at once. On retiring without a sound, Spire left the goose-quill flying over the paper. It was past noon before Cosmo, hearing him come in again on some pretense or other, raised his head for the first time and dropped the pen to say, "Give me my coat. I will go down to the dining-room." By that time the murmur of voices in the piazza had died out. The good Genoese had gone indoors to eat. Coming out of his light-filled room, Cosmo found the corridors cold and dark, like subterranean passages cut in rock, and the hall downstairs gloomy, like a burial vault. In contrast with it, the long dining-room had a festive air, a brilliancy that was almost crude. In a corner where the man who called himself Dr. Martel had his table, this glare was toned down by half-closed shutters, and Cosmo made his way there. Cantalucci's benefactor, seated sideways with one arm thrown over the chair's back, took Cosmo's arrival as a matter of course, greeted him with an amiable growl, and declared himself very sharp-set. Presently, laying down his knife and fork, he inquired what Cosmo had been doing that morning. Writing? Really? Thought that perhaps Cosmo had been doing the churches. One could see very pretty girls in the morning, waiting for their turn at the confessional. Cosmo, raising suddenly his eyes from his plate, caught his companion examining him keenly. The doctor burst into a loud laugh, till Cosmo's grave face recalled him to himself. "I beg your pardon. I remembered suddenly a very funny thing that happened to me last night. I'm afraid you think me very impolite. It was extremely funny." "Won't you tell me of it?" asked Cosmo coldly. "No, my dear sir, you are not in the mood. I prefer to apologize. There is a secret in it which is not mine. But as to the girls, I was perfectly serious. If you seek female beauty, you must look to the people for it. And in Genoa you will not look in vain. The women of the upper classes are alike everywhere. You must have remarked that." "I have hardly had time to look about me as yet," said Cosmo. He was no longer annoyed with the doctor, not even after he heard him say, "Surely yesterday evening you must have had an opportunity. You came home late." "I wonder who takes the trouble to watch my movements," remarked Cosmo carelessly. "Town police spies, of course," said the doctor grimly. "And perhaps one or two of the most enterprising thieves. You must make up your mind to that. After all, why should you care?" "Yes, why should I?" repeated Cosmo nonchalantly. "Do they report to you?" The doctor laughed again. "I see you haven't forgiven me my untimely merriment. But I will answer your question. No doubt I could hear a lot if I wanted to, both from the police and the thieves. But as a matter of fact, it was my courier who told me. He was talking with some friends outside this inn when you came home. You know you are a noticeable figure." "Oh, your courier. I suppose he hasn't got much else to do." "I see you are bent on quarreling, Mr. Latham," said the other, while two unexpected dimples appeared on his round cheeks. "All right. Only hadn't we better wait for some other opportunity? Don't you allow your man to talk while he is assisting you to dress? I must confess I let my fellow run on while he is shaving me in the morning. But then I am an easy-going sort of tramp, for I am just a tramp. I have no Latham Hall to go back to." He pushed his chair away from the table, stretched his legs, plunged his hands in his pockets complacently. How long was it he had been a tramp, he mused aloud. 20 years, or a little more. From one end of Europe to the other, from Madrid to Moscow, as one might say. Exactly like that Corsican fellow, only he hadn't dragged a tail of 200,000 men behind him, and had done no more bloodletting than his lancet was equal to. He looked up at Cosmo suddenly. "The lancet's my weapon, you know, not bayonet or saber. Cold steel, anyhow. Of course I found occasion to fire off my pistols more than once in the course of my travels, and I must say for myself that whenever I fired them it settled the business. One evening, I remember, in Transylvania, stepping out of a wretched inn to take a look round, I ran against a coalition of 3 powerful haiduks in tarry breeches, with moustaches a foot long. The moonlight was bright as day. I took in the situation at a glance, and I assure you 2 of them never made a sound as they fell, while the 3rd just grunted once. I fancy they had designs on my poor horse. He was inside the inn, you know, a custom of the country, men and animals under the same roof. I used to be sorry for the animals. When I came in again, the Jew had just finished frying the eggs. He had been very surly before, but when he served me, I noticed that he was shaking like a leaf. He tried to propitiate me by the offer of a sausage. I was simply ravenous. It made me ill for 2 days. That's why I haven't forgotten the occurrence. He nearly managed to avenge those bandits. Luckily, I had the right kind of drugs in my valise, and my iron constitution helped me to pull through. But I should like to have seen Bonaparte in that predicament. He wouldn't have known what to do, and anyhow the sausage would have finished him. His constitution is not like mine. He's unhealthy, sir. Unhealthy." "You had occasion to observe him often?" asked Cosmo, simply because he was reluctant to go back to his writing. "Our paths seldom crossed," stated the other simply. "But some time after the abdication I was passing through Valence. It's a tramp's business, you know, to keep moving. And I just had a good look at him outside the post-house. You may take it from me, he won't reach the term of the psalmist. Well, Mr. Latham, when I take a survey of the past, here we are, the Corsican and I, within, say, 100 miles of each other, at the end of 20 years of tramping, and frankly, which of us is the better off when all's said and done?" "That's a point of view," murmured Cosmo wearily. He added, however, that there were various ways of appreciating the careers of the world's great men. "There are," assented the other. "For instance, you would say that nothing short of the whole of Europe was needed to crush that fellow. But Pozzo di Borgo thinks that he has done it all by himself." At the name of the Emperor's Corsican enemy, Cosmo raised his head. He had caught sight in Paris of that personage at one or other of those great receptions from which he used to come away disgusted with the world and dissatisfied with himself. The doctor seemed inwardly amused by his recollection of Pozzo di Borgo. "He said to me," he continued, "Ah, if Bonaparte had had the sense not to quarrel with me, he wouldn't be in Elba now." What do you think of that, Mr. Latham? Is that a point of view? I should call it mad egotism. Yes, but the most amusing thing is that there is some truth in it. The private enmity of one man may be more dangerous or more effective than the hatred of millions on public grounds. Pozzo has the air of the Russian emperor. The fate of the Bourbons hung on a hair. Alexander's word was law, and who knows? Cosmo, plunged in abstraction, was repeating to himself mechanically, "The fate of the Bourbons hung on a hair. The fate of the Bourbons." Those words seemed meaningless. He tried to rouse himself. "Yes, Alexander," he murmured vaguely. The doctor raised his voice suddenly in a peevish tone. "I am not talking of Alexander of Macedon, Mr. Latham." His vanity had been hurt by Cosmo's attitude. The young man's faint smile placated him, and the incongruous dimples reappeared on the doctor's cheeks, while he continued. "Here you are. For Pozzo, Napoleon has always been a starveling squireen. For the prince, he has been principally the born enemy of good taste." "The prince?" repeated Cosmo, struggling to keep his head above the black waters of melancholia, which seemed to lap about his very lips. "You have said the prince, haven't you? What prince?" "Why, Talleyrand, of course. He did once tell him so, too. Pretty audacious, what? Well, I don't know. Suppose you were master of the world, and somebody were to tell you something of the sort to your face, what could you do? Nothing. You would have to gulp it, feeling pretty small. A private gentleman of good position could resent such a remark from an equal, but a master of the world couldn't. A master of the world, Mr. Latham, is very small potatoes, and I will tell you why. It's because he is alone of his kind, stuck up like a thief in the pillory for dead cats and cabbage stalks to be thrown at him. A devil of a position to be in, unless for a moment. But no man born of woman is a monster. There never was such a thing. A man who would really be a monster would arouse nothing but loathing and hatred. But this man has been loved by an army, by a people. For years his soldiers died for him with joy, now didn't they?" Cosmo perceived that he had managed to forget himself. "Yes," he said, "that cannot be denied." "No," continued the doctor. "And now, within 20 yards of us on the other side of the wall, there are millions of people who still love him. Hey, Cantalucci!" he called across the now empty length of the room. "Come here." The innkeeper, who had been noiselessly busy about a distant sideboard, approached with deference in his shirt-sleeves, girt with a long apron of which one corner was turned up, and with a white cap on his head. Being asked whether it was true that Italians loved Napoleon, he answered by a bow and said, "Excellency." "You think yourself that he is a great man, don't you?" pursued the doctor, and obtained another bow, and another murmured "Excellency." The doctor turned to Cosmo triumphantly. "You see? And Bonaparte has been stealing from them all he could lay his hands on for years. All their works of art. I am surprised he didn't take away the wall on which the Last Supper is painted. It makes my blood boil. I love Italy, you know." He addressed again the motionless Cantalucci. "But what is it that makes you people love this man?" This time Cantalucci did not bow. He seemed to make an effort. "Signore, it is the idea." The doctor directed his eyes again to Cosmo in silence. At last the innkeeper stepped back 3 paces before turning away from his English clients. The dimples had vanished from the doctor's full cheeks. There was something contemptuous in the peevishness of his thin lips and the extreme hardness of his eyes. They softened somewhat before he addressed Cosmo. "Here is another point of view for you. Devil only knows what that idea is, but I suspect it's vague enough to include every illusion that ever fooled mankind. There must be some charm in that gray coat and that old 3-cornered hat of his, for the man himself has betrayed every hatred and every hope that have helped him on his way." "What I am wondering at," Cosmo said at last, "is whether you have ever talked like this to anybody before." The doctor seemed taken aback a little. "Oh, you mean about Bonaparte?" he said. "If you had gone to that other inn, Pellegrini's, more suitable to your nationality and social position, you would have heard nothing of that kind. I'm not very communicative, really, but to sit at meals like two mutes would have been impossible. What could we have conversed about? One must have some subject other than the weather, and frankly, what other subject would we have had here in Genoa, or for that matter in any other spot of the civilized world? I know there are amongst us in England a good many young men who call themselves revolutionists and even republicans. Charming young men, generous and all that. Friends of Bonnet. You might be one of them." As he paused markedly, Cosmo murmured that he was hardly prepared to state what he was. That other inn, the Pellegrini, was full when he arrived. "Well, there had been 3 departures this morning," the doctor informed him. "You can have your things packed up this afternoon and carried across the place. You know, by staying here, you make yourself conspicuous to the spies, not to speak of the thieves. They ask themselves, what sort of inferior Englishman is that? With me it is different. I am known for a man who has his own work to do. People are curious, and as my work is confidential, I prefer to keep out of the way rather than have to be rude. But for you it would be more amusing to live over there. New faces all the time, endless gossip about all sorts of people." "I do not think it is worth while to change now," said Cosmo coldly. "Of course not. If you are not going to prolong your stay, if you project a visit to Elba, Livorno is the port for that. And if you are anxious to hear about Napoleon, you will hear plenty of gossip about him there. Here you have nothing but my talk." "I have found it very interesting," said Cosmo, rising to go away. The doctor smiled without amiability. He was determined never to let Cosmo guess that he knew of his acquaintance with the people occupying the palace guarded by the symbolic griffins. Of that fact he had been made aware by the Count de Monteveso, who, once he had got the doctor into Clelia's room, decided to take him into his confidence, on the ground that one must be frank with a medical man. The real reason was, however, that knowing Dr. Martel to be employed on secret political work by the statesmen of the Alliance, and having a very great idea of his occult influences in all sorts of spheres, he hoped to get from him another sort of assistance. His last words were, "You see yourself the state the child is in. I want that popinjay moved out of Genoa." The only answer of the doctor to this, and the last sound during that professional visit that Count de Monteveso heard from him, was a short wooden laugh. That man of political intrigues, confidential missions, often he had more than one at a time on his hands, inordinately vain of his backstairs importance, was not mercenary. He had always preserved a most independent attitude towards his employers. To him, the Count de Monteveso was but a common, stupid soldier of fortune, of no importance and of no position, except as the son-in-law of the Marquis d'Armand. He had never seen him before, but his marital life was known to him as it was known to the rest of the world. To be waylaid by a strange priest just as he was leaving the Marquis's room was annoying enough, but he could not very well refuse the request, since it seemed to be a case of sudden illness. He was soon enlightened as to its nature by Clelia, who had treated him and the Count to another of her indescribable performances. Characteristically enough, the doctor had never been for a moment irritated with the girl. He behaved by her tempestuous bedside like a man of science, calm, attentive, impenetrable. But it was afterwards, when he had been drawn aside by the Count for a confidential talk, that he had asked himself whether he were dreaming or awake. His scorn for the man helped him to preserve his self-command, and to the end the Count was not intelligent enough to perceive its character. The doctor left the palazzo about an hour after Cosmo, but not by the same staircase, and on his way to his inn gave rein to his indignation. Did the stupid brute imagine that he had any sort of claim on his services? He wanted that popinjay removed from Genoa, indeed, and what the devil did he care for it? Was he expected to arrange a neat little assassination to please that solemn wooden imbecile? The doctor's sense of self-importance was grievously hurt. Even in the morning, after a good night's rest, he had not shaken off the impression. However, he was reasonable enough not to make Cosmo in any way responsible for what he defined to himself as the most incredibly offensive experience of his life. He only looked at him, when he came to lunch, with a sort of acid amusement as the being who had had the power to arouse a passion of love in the primitive soul of that curious little savage. As the meal proceeded, the doctor seemed to notice that his young countryman was somehow changed. He watched him covertly. What had happened to him since last evening? Surely he hadn't been smitten himself by the little savage that under no circumstances could have been made fit to be a housemaid in an English family. After he had been left by Cosmo alone in the dining-room, the doctor's body continued to loll in the chair while his thoughts continued to circle around that funny affair, of which you couldn't say whether it was love at first sight or a manifestation of some inherited lunacy. Quite a good-looking young man, out of the common, too, in a distinguished way. Altogether a specimen of one's countrymen one could well be proud of, mused further the doctor, whose tastes had been formed by much intercourse with all kinds of people. Characteristically enough, too, he felt for a moment sorry in his grumpy, contemptuous way for the little disheveled savage with a hooked nose and burning cheeks, and her thin sticks of bare arms. The doctor was humane. The origin of his reputation sprang from his humanity. But his thought, as soon as it left Clelia, stopped short, as it were, before another image that replaced it in his mind. He had remembered the Countess de Monteveso. He knew her of old by sight and reputation. He had seen her no further back than last night by the side of the old Marquis's chair. Now he had seen the Count de Monteveso himself. He could well believe all the stories of a lifelong jealousy. The doctor's hard, active eyes stared fixedly at the truth. It was not because of that little savage that gloomy, self-tormenting ass of a drill sergeant to an Indian prince wanted young Latham removed from Genoa. Oh, dear, no, that wasn't it at all. It was much more serious. Before he walked out of the empty dining-room, Dr. Martell concluded that it would be perhaps just as well for young Latham not to linger too long in Genoa. Chapter 2. Cosmo, having returned to his room, sat down again at the writing-table. For was not this day to be devoted to correspondence? Long after the shade had invaded the greater part of the square below, he went on, while the faint shuffle of footsteps and the faint murmur of voices reached him from the pavement, like the composite sound of agitated insect life that can be heard in the depths of a forest. It required all his courage to keep on, piling up words which dealt exclusively with towns, roads, rivers, mountains, the colors of the sky. It was like laboring the description of the scenery of a stage after a great play had come to an end. A vain thing. And still he traveled on. Having at last descended into the Italian plain for the benefit of Henrietta, he dropped his pen and thought, "At this rate I will never arrive in Genoa." He fell back in his chair like a weary traveler. He was suddenly overcome by that weary distaste a frank nature feels after an effort at concealing an overpowering sentiment. But had he really anything to conceal? He asked himself. Suddenly the door flew open, and Spire marched in with 4 lighted candles on a tray. It was only then that Cosmo became aware how late it was. Had I not better tear all this up, he thought, looking down at the sheets before him. Spire put 2 candlesticks on the table, disposed the 2 others, one each side of the mantelpiece, and was going out. "Wait!" cried Cosmo. It was like a cry of distress. Spire shut the door quietly and turned about, betraying no emotion. Cosmo seized the pen again and concluded hastily, "I have been in Genoa for the last 2 days. I have seen Adele and the Marquis. They send their love. You shall have lots about them in my next. I have no time now to tell you what a wonderful person she has become, but perhaps you would not think so." After he had signed it, the thought struck him that there was nothing about Napoleon in his letter. He must put in something about Napoleon. He added a postscript. "You can form no idea of the state of suspense in which all classes live here, from the highest to the lowest, as to what may happen next. All their thoughts are concentrated on Bonaparte. Rumors are flying about of some sort of violence that may be offered to him. Assassination, kidnapping. It's difficult to credit it all, though I do believe that the Congress in Vienna is capable of any atrocity. A person I met here suggested that I should go to Livorno. Perhaps I will. But I have lost, I don't know why, all desire to travel. Should I find a ship ready to sail for England in Livorno, I may take passage in her and come home at once by sea." Cosmo collected the pages, and while closing the packet, asked himself whether he ought to tell her that. Was it the fact that he had lost all wish to travel? However, he let Spire take the packet to the post, and during the man's absence took a turn or 2 in the room. He had got through the day. Now there was the evening to get through somehow. But when it occurred to him that the evening would be followed by the hours of an endless night, filled by the conflict of shadowy thoughts that haunt the birth of a passion, the desolation of the prospect was so overpowering that he could only meet it with a bitter laugh. Spire, returning, stood thunderstruck at the door. "What's the matter with you? Have you seen a ghost?" asked Cosmo, who ceased laughing suddenly and fixed the valet with distracted eyes. "No, sir, certainly not. I was wondering whether you hadn't better dine in your room." "What do you mean? Am I not fit to be seen?" asked Cosmo captiously, glancing at himself in the mirror, as though the crisis through which he had passed in the last 3 or 4 minutes could have distorted his face. Spire made no answer. The sound of that laugh had made him lose his conventional bearing, while Cosmo wondered what had happened to that imbecile and glared at him suspiciously. "Give me my coat," he said at last. "I am going downstairs." This broke the spell, and Spire, getting into motion, regained his composure. "Noisy company down there, sir. I thought you might not like it." Cosmo felt a sudden longing to hear noise, lots of it, senseless, loud, common, absurd noise. Noise loud enough to prevent one from thinking, the sort of noise that would cause one to become, as it were, insensible. "What do you want?" he asked savagely of Spire, who was hovering at his back. "I'm ready to help you with your coat, sir," said Spire in an apathetic voice. He had been profoundly shocked. After his master had gone out, slamming the door behind him, he busied himself with a stony face in putting the room to rights. before he blew out the candles and left it to get his supper. "Didn't you advise me this morning to go to Livorno?" asked Cosmo, falling heavily into the chair. Dr. Martel was already at table, and except that he had changed his boots for silk stockings and shoes, he might not have moved from there all the afternoon. "Livorno," repeated that strange man. "Did I?" "Yes. The road along the Riviera di Levante is delightful for any person sensible to the beauties of Italian landscapes." He paused with a sour expression in the noise of voices filling the room, and muttered that no doubt Cantellucci found that sort of thing pay, but that the place was becoming impossible. Cosmo was just thinking that there was not half enough uproar there. The naval officers seemed strangely subdued that evening. The same old lieutenant, with sunken cheeks and a sharp nose, in the same shabby uniform, was at the head of the table. Cantellucci, wearing a long-skirted maroon coat, now glided about the room, unobtrusive and vigilant. His benefactor beckoned to him. "You would know where to find a man with 4 good horses for the signore's carriage?" he asked, and accepting Cantellucci's low bow as an affirmative, addressed himself to Cosmo. "The road's perfectly safe. The country's full of Austrian troops." "I think I would prefer to go by sea," said Cosmo, who had not thought of making any arrangements for the journey. Instantly Cantellucci glided away, while the doctor emitted a grunt and applied himself to his dinner. Cosmo thought desperately, "Oh, yes, the sea. Why not the sea? Away from everybody." He had been rolling and bumping on the roads, good, bad, and indifferent, in dust or mud, meeting in inns ladies and gentlemen for days and days between Paris and Genoa, and for a moment he was fascinated by the notion of a steady, gliding progress in company of 3 or 4 bronzed sailors over a blue sea, in sight of a picturesque coast of rocks and hills, crowded with pines, with opening valleys, with white villages and purple promontories of lovely shape. It was like a dream which lasted till the doctor was heard suddenly saying, "I think I could find somebody that would take your traveling carriage off your hands." And the awakening came with an inward recoil of all Cosmo's being, as if before a vision of irrevocable consequences. The doctor lowered his eyelids. "He is changed," he said to himself. "Oh, yes, he is changed." This, however, did not prevent him from feeling irritated by Cosmo's lack of response to the offer to dispose of his traveling carriage. "There are many people that would consider themselves lucky to have such an offer made to them," he remarked, after a period of silence. "It is not so easy at this time to get rid of a traveling carriage, nor yet to have an opportunity to hire a dependable man with 4 good horses if you want to go by land. I mean at a time like this, when anything may happen any day." "I am sure I am very much obliged to you," said Cosmo, "but I am really in no hurry." The doctor took notice of Cosmo's languid attitude and the untouched plate before him. "The trouble is that you don't seem to have any aims at all, isn't that it?" "Yes, I confess," said Cosmo carelessly. "I think I want a rest." "Well, Mr. Latham, you had better see that you get it, then. This place isn't restful, it is merely dull. And then suppose you were suddenly to perceive an aim, such, for instance, as to visit Elba. You may be too late if you linger unduly. You know you are not likely to see a specimen like that one over there again in your lifetime, and even he may not be with us very long." "You seem very positive about that," said Cosmo, looking at his interlocutor searchingly. "This is the 3rd or 4th time that I hear that sort of allusion from you. Have you any special information?" "Yes, of a sort. It has been my lot to hear much of what is said in high places, and the nature of my occupation has given me much practice in appreciating what is said." "In high places," interjected Cosmo. "And in low, too," retorted the doctor a little impatiently, "if that is the distinction you have in your mind, Mr. Latham. However, I told you I have been in Vienna quite recently, and I have heard something there." "From Prince Talleyrand?" was Cosmo's stolid suggestion. The doctor smiled acidly. "Not a bad guess. I did hear something at Prince Talleyrand's. I heard it from Montron's. You know whom I mean." "Never heard of him. Who is he?" "Never heard of Montron? Oh, I forgot. You have been shut up in that tight island of ours. Monsieur Montron has the advantage to live near the Rose, you understand me? He is the intimate companion to the Prince, has been for many years. The Prince told somebody once that he liked Montron because he was not excessively scrupulous. That just paints the man for you. I was talking with Monsieur Montron about Bonaparte's future, and I was not trying to be unkind either. I pointed out that one could hardly expect him to settle down if the French government were not made to pay him the money guaranteed under the treaty. He could see the moment he would find himself without a penny. That's enough to make any human being restive. He was bound to try and do something. A man must live, I said. And Montron looks at me sideways and says deliberately, 'Oh, here we don't see the necessity.' You understand that after a hint like this, I dropped the subject. It's a point of view like another, eh, Mr. Latham?" Cosmo was impressed. "I heard last night," he said, "that he is taking precautions for his personal safety." He remembered, perhaps, what happened to a certain Duc d'Enghien, a young man who obviously didn't take precautions. "So you heard that story? Well, in Livorno you will hear many sorts of stories. Livorno is an exciting place, and an excellent point to start from for a visit to Elba, which would be a great memory for your old age. And if you happen to observe anything remarkable there, I would thank you to drop me a line, care of Contelucci. You see, I have put some money into a deal of oil, and I don't know how it is, everything in the world, even a little twopenny affair like that, is affected by this feeling of suspense that man's presence gives rise to. Hopes, plans, affections, love affairs. If I were you, Mr. Latham, I would certainly go to Livorno." He waited a little before he got up, muttering something about having a lot of pen work to do, and went out, Contelucci hastening to open the door for him. Cosmo remained passive in his chair. The room emptied itself gradually, and there was not even a servant left in it when Cosmo rose in his turn. He went back to his room, threw a few pieces of wood on the fire, and sat down. He felt as if lost in a strange world. He doubted whether he ought not to have called that day at the palace, if only to say good-bye. And suddenly all the occurrences and even words of the day before assailed his memory. The morning call, the mulatto girl, the sunshine in Madame de Monteveso's boudoir, the seduction of her voice, the emotional appeal of her story had stirred him to the depths of his soul. Where was the man who could have imagined the existence of a being of such splendid humanity, with such a voice, with such amazing harmony of aspect, expression, gesture, with such a face in this gross world of mortals in which Lady Jane and Mrs. R.'s daughters counted for the most exquisite products offered to the love of men? And yet Cosmo remembered now that even while all his senses had been thrown into confusion by the first sight of Madame de Monteveso, he had felt dimly that she was no stranger, that he had seen her glory before. The presence, the glance, the lips, He did not connect that dim recognition with the child Adele. No child could have promised a woman like this. It was rather like the awed recollection of a prophetic vision, and it had been in Latham Hall, but not in a dream. He was certain no man ever found the premonition of such a marvel in the obscure promptings of slumbering flesh. And it was not in a vision of his own. Such visions were for artists, for inspired seers. She must have been foretold to him in some picture he had seen in Latham Hall, where one came on pictures mostly of the Italian school, in unexpected places, on landings, at the end of dark corridors, in spare bedrooms. A luminous oval face on the dark background, the noble, full-length woman stepping out of the narrow frame with long draperies held by jeweled clasps and girdle, with pearls on head and bosom, carrying a book and a pen, or was it a palm? And yes, he saw it plainly with terror, with her left breast pierced by a dagger. He saw it there plainly, as if the blow had been struck before his eyes. The released hilt seemed to vibrate yet, while the eyes looked straight at him, profound, unconscious, in miraculous tranquility. Terror-struck, as if at the discovery of a crime, he jumped up, trembling in every limb. He had a horror of the room, of being alone within its four bare walls on which there were no pictures except that awful one which seemed to hang in the air before his eyes. Cosmo felt that he must get away from it. He snatched up his cloak and hat and fled into the corridor. The hour was late, and everything was very still. He did not see as much as a flitting shadow on the bare, rough walls of the unfinished palace, awaiting the decoration of marbles and bronzes that would never cover its nakedness now. The dwelling of the Grazianis stood as dumb and cold in all its lofty depths as at that desolate hour of the dreadful siege, when its owner lay dead of hunger at the foot of the great flight of stairs. It was only in the hall below that Cosmo caught from behind one of the closed doors faint, almost ghostly murmurs of disputing voices. The two hanging lanterns could not light up that grandly planned cavern in all its extent, but Cosmo made out a dim shape of the elderly lieutenant sitting all alone and perfectly still against the wall, with a bottle of wine before him. By the time he had reached the pavement, Cosmo had mastered his trembling and had steadied his thoughts.